Hello, my name is Torben Pederson, one of the editors of Global Strategy Journal here, and I'm sitting together with Professor Jean François Hennart, which was winner of the best paper prize of global strategy here, because he 5 years ago wrote a phenomenal paper here. So I will ask Jean François Hennart to tell a little bit more about this paper. So Jean François Hennart, can you say very shortly what is the point, what is the contribution of this paper?
So the contribution of this paper is that it basically explains something which existing theories of foreign investment by emerging market multinationals do not explain very well. Now we have the Luo and Tung springboard theory. We have theories which argue that emerging market multinationals make investment abroad not so much to exploit their advantages, but to acquire advantages. But what is not explained is how do they manage to get the competitive space and also the finances, and how do they have the bargaining power that they need to be able to acquire intangibles in other countries. Because if you're going to acquire a Western firm, if you're going to go and try to persuade your joint venture partners, your Western joint venture partners to share with you technology, you need to have some bargaining power, you need to have some funds to be able to obtain those things. The springboard model does not explain at all why emerging market firms are able to get the money and get the bargaining power to acquire this technology. And the paper basically makes a very simple argument. First, it says the game for most emerging market firms is not in foreign markets, but is in their domestic markets. So this is where we have to start. Most of their strategy is based by increasing or maintaining their market share in their own markets in competition with Western multinationals, which are competing with them in their own market. And therefore, that's the first point. The second point is to say, under what conditions will emerging market firms be able to compete, to survive, given the competition of these Western multinationals? And the key issue here is that whenever you make an investment, whenever foreign firms make an investment in emerging markets, in the markets of emerging markets, emerging market countries, they need to link their intangibles with local resources. So in almost all cases, when you make an investment, you have to link with local resources.
So that's a bundling argument you talk about.
It's a bundling argument, and of course, the argument then goes on that the kind of optimistic idea of most of existing IB theory, that those local resources are freely available to the multinational firm so that they can be bundled with difficult to sell technology into wholly owned affiliates, that actually this scenario is not, it's a special scenario, but in many cases, local resources are actually controlled by local firms, and this is what gives them bargaining power. So this is a very simple argument.
So I understand that you're breaking with existing knowledge in different ways. For example, by saying that you should focus more on the domestic market and not international exploitation and things like that. That's one thing. Another thing is this about bundling resources and not all resources locally are freely available to all firms in that location, so to say. So you're breaking with existing conventions, so to say. In different ways.
Absolutely, because the oil line model treats differently ownership advantages, which are typically intangibles. Those intangibles are supposed to be firm-specific, proprietary, but for some reason, the local firms, the country-specific advantages, are supposed to be available to everyone, foreign firms and domestic firms, in an equal basis. So this is a very strange assumption. But this very strange assumption has been taken seriously by many scholars, and therefore their argument, for example, there is an argument by Lessard, in which basically says that emerging market firms do not have long-lasting advantages because those advantages are based on natural resources, and those natural resources, local factors, are available to everyone. So you have to kind of get out of the idea that that complementary local factors, that is non-technology factors, non-intangibles, are for some reason less strategic than intangibles. And in fact, I go further, I make the argument in the paper that actually intangibles are becoming less strategic because they're becoming more available on global markets, while actually access to consumers, access to natural resources in the host markets is not getting any easier, if anything. So not only do I actually say that you should treat on the same level intangibles and complementary local resources, but I go further and make the argument that actually it appears that increasingly what is strategic is not the intangibles, because they're increasingly available on markets, but what is actually more strategic is access to consumers, is access to natural resources, is access to complementary factors in the home markets of emerging market firms.
Okay, good. So can you say a little bit about how did that idea come to you, so to say? So since you're breaking with different assumptions here.
So actually the original, the original idea of bundling comes from my '88 SMJ article on transaction cost theory of equity joint ventures. And this article actually was motivated by the fact that if you looked at most of the explanation of why do firms, so the argument, the interesting question is, why do firms joint venture as a first best strategy, right? Why do firms share ownership of their affiliates as a first best strategy? And the argument is, well, they do that because it's a condition to access complementary resources, right? So the typical market entry joint venture is a joint venture under which a firm with intangibles typically shares ownership of the local subsidiary in order to get country-specific knowledge, in order to get access to distribution and other local factors. So this was the original idea in '88. And of course, this is a market entry joint venture is a special case of joint venture in general. But the idea is that you share ownership of a local affiliate with local firms, in that particular case, whenever you need to provide incentive to the local firm to actually help you out getting market share in a target market. So this was actually the original idea. In 2009, GIBS had a 40th anniversary issue, and I thought I should really make a contribution there, because I knew that all the other people who have competing theory would actually have articles there. So it was not so much a question that you need to be there, but the question that you can't afford not to be there. And so I actually said, how can I actually leverage this idea in a more general way? So I came with this bundling paper, bundling model. And one of the implications at the very end of this article in 2009 was that, in fact, this explains a lot about the success of emerging market firms. Now, this was, at that time, a pure speculation. I had no empirical evidence. But then you asked me to write something for the Global Strategy Journal. And I said, okay, well, no, I think this is actually right. But I don't have any evidence. So how do I get evidence? So what I did is that I basically went through what was then called the European Case Clearinghouse, and I looked for cases of any firms in emerging market, fairly successful firms in emerging markets. And then I read through all the cases on those firms. Of course, those cases are not written with this in mind, right? So you had to kind of read through the lines. And it turned out to be, so I came up with, I think, I looked at Huawei, I looked at Lenovo, I looked at Haier, I looked at Bimbo in Mexico, I looked at CVR de Valle in Brazil. And even though they were in different industries and in different contexts, in different emerging markets, the picture came out very loud and clear.
Okay.
That actually the strategy those firms had used to be able to compete with foreign multinationals in their home market was actually to get access to distribution.
Okay.
Or in the case of Vale, to get access to iron ore deposits.
Mm-hmm.
So Vale now is the only exporter of iron ore out of Brazil,
Mm-hmm.
which of course gives it bargaining power vis-a-vis the buyers.
Yeah.
And with this bargaining power, they were able to buy Inco,
Okay.
which is the largest nickel
Yeah.
firms in Canada, copper and nickel.
Yeah.
And if you look also Bimbo, which is a Mexican firm that sells baked products, bread and baked products. Their strength is the fact that they've got central bakeries, and every day they make something like 500,000 deliveries
Okay.
to small shops in villages throughout Mexico with fresh bread and fresh bakery products.
Okay.
So this access to distribution actually helped them fight off an attack by Pepsi through Frito-Lay, which actually tried to get market share in Mexico, and they were beaten up by Bimbo because Bimbo basically has this organized distribution that has taken them years to build on, which Frito-Lay was not able to replicate very quickly. So since then, actually, I found even more cases. I think Asterlik in Turkey is a good example. Aramex, which is a courier service firms based in the Gulf countries and the Middle East, and all those firms basically got bargaining power by controlling access to consumers or controlling access, in the case of Vale, to raw materials. And of course, there is the additional case that sometimes the government, in the case of, for example, Brazil, the government was very helpful in helping Vale to get this bargaining power by letting them buy all domestic firms. In the case, of course, there is other cases where the government has taken a very active role as a sole buyer of in the country, in basically coalescing domestic firms so that actually they have strong bargaining power vis-a-vis foreign firms. And the best example of that is Fast Train in China, where the Chinese government basically has played the 4 Western companies which have expertise in that, once against the other, and obtain full access to technology in exchange for market access. Because you can do that both in terms of acquisition, which is what Lu and Tong are talking about, but you also can do that through joint ventures, in which you condition access to your markets on sharing technology.
Okay, so it's actually very interesting, your methods. You also say this about that you have this idea and then you go and look for the cases that of course has been written with another purpose, as you say, but you if you read between the lines, you actually find
that is
very interesting. So today we know that your paper has been cited a lot. Your GSJ paper has been cited a lot, and that's of course why you get also one of the reasons why you get the best paper prize here. But have you any, do you know how people have been building on this idea, and are you satisfied with how it has been received in the literature, and how others have been building on it? Or
so I have to say it takes this is kind of a it is to some extent, I mean to a limited extent, but to some extent it's a radical idea, in part because the academic fields tend to be very much like silos, right? So some people do marketing, but if they do marketing, they don't do strategic marketing, in that sense that they don't look at the impact of distribution on the strategy of the firm, right? So here what I'm basically saying is, well, technology is important, but maybe not that important, right? That goes against the trend now in strategy. If you look at strategy journals.
Resource
They're all
based,
about
knowledge
technology.
based. Yeah.
It's all about technology, right?
Yeah.
It's all about using patents and you talk about technology. But basically, what I'm saying is that maybe marketing is more important than technology. But the problem, of course, is that marketers are not interested in strategy, and strategy people are not interested in marketing. So I'm actually kind of punching here in this void between those two things, which I think it takes a while for people actually to refocus and to rethink in those terms. Another thing which I think is interesting but a bit of a challenge is that it basically says that most existing studies on market entry are wrong because they've only looked at one side of the story. So when you look, for example, at whether a multinational firm entering a country will choose between wholly owned subsidiaries or joint ventures, this has nothing to do with the firm's technology, actually. It has to do with what complementary asset the firm needs to access and whether those complementary assets can actually be obtained on efficient markets, in which case the firm will have a wholly owned subsidiary. If they're not accessible on efficient markets, then the firm will choose a joint venture. But that basically means that you have to look not so much at character, because if you look at multinational firms that enter through foreign investment, by definition it's because their technology cannot be licensed to local firms. So by definition, those firms have fairly high technology, which is difficult to market to local firms through licensing or franchising. So what actually makes a difference then is conditions in the target country. But to model actually the efficiency by which complementary assets can be purchased or not purchased is quite difficult. It requires a good knowledge of the target country, right? And it requires two things. You need to figure out what are the crucial complementary assets, because obviously many complementary assets may be difficult to acquire, but they're not crucial. What are the crucial complementary assets? And secondly, what is the competitive conditions involving those complementary assets? That requires a lot of detailed institutional knowledge of the target country, which is a lot harder to do than to collect data through existing databases, like Compustat or the like, and just plugging in your. So you can see why the fact that I'm telling people that what has been done up to now is actually not very good, and what they need to do is spend a lot more time collecting detailed data about host markets where the multinationals are investing. You could see why this is not welcome with open arms, because it basically tells that people have to do much more work, more complex work, and much more context-specific work, which of course I think is one of the problems among many people teaching IBs, is that they don't really have very good knowledge of specific context. It's also an interesting point, because you have to look about this is of course the problem with transaction cost theory. You need to look at small details, and you need to understand the institutional context in which you're talking about.
So finally, your advice to how we should build on it is along those lines of that we should actually try to understand the context much better, and the bundling and in that way, as you just explained it.
And also, what's interesting is that, as you present the paper and as you think about it, people come up with objections. So clearly every theory has boundary conditions, right? So the boundary condition, I think, here is that this applies mostly to the usual, I think what is the usual case in emerging markets, which are firms which are mostly directed towards their home market. Okay. And there's a lot of the logic of that is quite simple, because if your home market is growing at 10% per year and it has unlimited opportunities, you're not going to be bothered about trying to sell to Denmark. Right?
No.
Okay, so you've got 1.3 billion people in your home market growing, the market is growing at 10%. You're not going to go and start making adaptation to your product to sell outside your home market. So, but clearly, if your emerging markets differ in market size. So this theory is more applicable to India, China, and Brazil than it is to say Argentina or Ecuador or or even smaller countries such as Cambodia, right, or Vietnam.
Yeah.
First point. Second point, some emerging market firms, their main customers actually not domestically but internationally. Yeah. So if you looked at the Indian IT industry, the Indian IT industry strategies are really driven by what goes on in Europe and in the US.
Okay.
So clearly that is slightly a different situation. Thirdly, the role of government in helping domestic firms varies a lot across countries. So if you contrast, for example, Brazil and Argentina have been perfectly, or Chile, Argentina and Chile, the government has not really interfered in protecting domestic firms, while in Brazil it has, or in Russia, or in India, or in China it has, right? So the Chinese government has been very, very consistent in trying to extract knowledge from Western firms by forcing them to joint venture, by preventing them from entering certain industries, for example, the social network industry, which it has basically kept for Chinese firms for many reasons. But this is not the norm across all industries within a country, and it's not a norm across all countries. So obviously this is a very interesting aspect, but which does make a difference. What's also very interesting about this whole thing is, for example, if you look at a firm like Aserlik, which controls as many shops in Turkey and controls distribution in Turkey, how long does that last? Right? Yeah. Nothing in life is forever. So obviously, control of distribution may evolve over time, and so the advantage that the emerging market firms have built in their own market may not last forever, right? So this is a very dynamic situation, and obviously it has to be followed. Okay. But it's, by the way, this idea of the importance of complementary assets is not something which is entirely new, because my feeling is that, but I don't have evidence on that, is that if you looked at the French government, for example, in the 1960s and 70s, if you look at the case of Airbus, it's clearly leveraging demand in order to, leveraging access to demand, which was through the state-owned airlines, like Air France, Lufthansa, and the like, in order to build the domestic industry and in order to bargain, to parlay this market access against access to technology. So this is not entirely new, and it's been played by developed countries as well.
Okay, good.
But again, the larger ones have more bargaining power than, say, Denmark, right? Denmark doesn't have this choice set that say France or Germany has, and especially the EU now has.
Okay, thanks a lot for this very insightful explanation of this paper, and once again, congratulations for this fantastic paper.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you, Torben.